Good morning, students, or afternoon or evening. Doesn't really matter what time you're watching this. The content is still the same regardless of hour. This is our first micro lesson series, and we're going to be covering understanding expressions, specifically in regards to key vocabulary. Key vocab. So the words we kind of have to understand before we can know what we're doing with each of the pieces. So one big question that a lot of students have or they're confused about are expressions or operations. We see those words a lot versus a equation. So the difference between these two is that expressions just mean an action, whereas an equation means that there's some sort of relationship, which I'll explain further later. Some sort of relationship. So an action could be something as simple as 1 plus 3. That's an expression. It could also be something more complex. Something you might have seen before could be involving variables. X squared minus 8, all in a parentheses, times 3. Both of these are expressions or operations because something is happening. Things are being added, things are being exponentially increased, subtracted, and multiplied. With an equation, some sort of relationship means that we're comparing two things. Either they're the same, they're not the same, or something could be bigger. So we could say something like this. 3 equals 3. That's an equation because we're comparing these two pieces of things. 3, does that equal 3? True. So some equations, they might give you something that's not true. Or they might give you something that's missing a piece of information. We could have 1 plus 4 equals 6. And then you would have to cross out that equal sign because they're not the same thing. You could have something like x plus 2 equals 4. And because you understand what this sign means, this equal sign means that these two sides have to be the same. That means this piece right over here, x plus 2, has to equal this. So if we had something like that, x plus 2 is less than 4, then this whole thing, these two together, have to be less than 4. And we'll talk a little bit more about some common problems we'll see, but right now we're just going to talk about the definition of each of these. An expression is, or operation is an action, something that's happening. An equation is some sort of relationship between two things. They could be equal, they could be less than, they could be not equal, and some other things that we'll cover later. Another key vocab word that we're going to see are coefficients. C-O-E-F-F-I-C-I-E-N-T. Coefficients. What that means, and this is super simple, but they just like big words for some reason, is the number in front of another thing. Another thing. Let's actually use a different color for that so we know what's happening. Number in front of another thing. So some examples we might see could be a 3 in front of a x. That's a coefficient, that 3 right there. Or you could see something like a 5 in front of a strawberry. Or we'll make them grapes because we're using purple. Grapes. 5 grapes. What that means, based on what we're looking at here, if we put little dots, We don't need those dots there. It just means these two things are being multiplied. But a coefficient is just the number in front of another thing. That's a coefficient. Third, we have variables. I'm sure a lot of you probably already know. That's a variable. That's a variable. That could be a variable. We could draw a face with hair. That could be a variable. It could be an orange. That could be a variable. What a variable is just something used to represent an unknown. So if we go back to our previous language, we could say, actually, let's not erase that. We can turn each of these into expressions and equations. That's an orange. We could say that we have 5 oranges. That's an expression. Or if we're doing something else, we could say that we have apple. That's an apple. We could have 3 apples equals 2 oranges. We don't know how much an orange is actually worth here. No one's told us. But we know that 2, and this is an equation now because it's comparing 2 things, 2 oranges is equivalent to 3 apples. So a variable is just used to represent something that is unknown. That's all it is. And then finally, something that we're going to cover a lot more probably starting in a few weeks is this word, a factor. Factor. And I'm sure we've seen that word before, greatest common factor. And we probably did something like this, where we had a number, we drew out little dividers, and it's like, okay, we know 3 times 6 is 18. We can even go a little bit further. We know 2 times 3 is that. And then you could keep going further, like this is 1 and 3, this is 1 and 2, but that doesn't really give us that much more useful information. So factors are, let's see, how can we best describe it? Factors are what numbers multiply, and I like to use the word fit, like they fit inside that. What numbers multiply into our target number. All right, so if we have 18, we knew that 3 times 6 is 18, so we could say that 3 and 6 multiplied together fit inside 18. Those are numbers that fit. We're not adding, we're multiplying those numbers together. And factor is going to be a really useful thing when we start doing some things backwards. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a different lesson, about why we want to do certain things backwards and why it's important how it relates to real life math problems. But that pretty much covers the key vocab that we're going to want to understand for the other mini lessons that we're going to cover.